The corporate watchdog has warned major businesses that it will come after board directors and executives who are unprepared for cyber attacks. Trade unions want a revolution at the Reserve Bank under Michele Bullock's leadership, and CEOs have received pay rises far outstripping inflation and also far larger than those of the typical Australian worker. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Tuesday, the 19th of September, 2023. I'm Michael Thompson, and Sean Aylmer is still away. I'm joined instead by Jennifer Duke. Jen, good morning.
Good morning, Michael.
You have an interview coming up today after the show with Robbie Sharon-Zipser, who is the CEO of hipages, which if you have ever watched The Block, you would probably be very familiar with hipages.
That's right. It's kind of like, I guess, Airtasker for tradies, I suppose. And it was really interesting to hear from him sort of how the construction industry's challenges have had this knock-on effect for how tradies are actually using his platform. And we also got into the nuts and bolts of how they responded when the consumer watchdog actually came knocking at their door.
Yeah, and Robbie was very upfront about all of that. It is a really good interview. It's worth a listen. It's coming up a bit later on. The main story this morning, though, Jen, the corporate watchdog has warned major businesses that it will come after board directors and executives who are unprepared for cyber attacks. It is the most strongly worded caution yet from the regulator on the issue of cybersecurity breaches. And perhaps also a potential indication of broader concerns about just how ready businesses are for a rise in cybercrime.
The Australian Securities and Investments Commission Chairman Joseph Longo was at the Australian Financial Review Cyber Summit yesterday, and he said that the regulator will go after boards and the C-suite with legal action if they're found to have been recklessly unprotected against cyber hacks and haven't looked after their customers and their infrastructure properly. He also warned firms against blindly assuming that third-party providers of tech and services are well protected themselves.
This is such a big issue at the moment, Jen. We've seen some really high-profile cases lately, like Optus and Medibank, of course, and even one we discussed yesterday with Dymocks, the bookstores, telling customers that their data had been shared on the dark web.
Yeah, the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner actually recorded 409 data breaches in the 6 months to June this year. So that's a really big figure. And it's clear this is an issue that's going to keep on growing. So ASIC staff are now going to be actively looking for companies that have taken any shortcuts or have failed to prepare properly and have ended up sitting ducks for cyber criminals. Longo actually told the summit that cyber resilience must be a top priority right now, because while cybercrime is going to happen, he said it's about ensuring that reasonable steps and investments proportionate to those risks are being taken. And where they haven't been, companies can expect to face legal proceedings.
All right. And so I suppose the big question for anyone sitting there going, I don't know how prepared we are. Was there any advice at the summit for what businesses should be doing?
So there was quite a lot, and some of the best came from former Telstra boss Andy Penn, who was also at the event. And he said that boards needed to know what data they hold. They need an inventory of their IT systems. They need a plan to upgrade and a response plan for any breach. And they have to be ready to fix up their systems if cyber attacks are successful. Now, Penn is actually chairing the government's review of the national cybersecurity strategy at the moment. And he said that telcos and financial services firms are much further ahead than many other industries on cybersecurity. And that's probably partly due to the Medibank and Optus cyber breach fallout. Major business leaders were also at the event, such as Westpac Chief Information Security Officer Richard Johnson, and he encouraged the government to help hit back at the attackers and coordinate to block threats. Home Affairs Minister Claire O'Neil said that the Optus cyber attack woke the country up to the huge priority of cybersecurity, and the government has actually been undertaking some drills with businesses, particularly those deemed to be critical infrastructure, so that is the finance and the telcos, to make sure that they're prepared for cyber attacks. These types of businesses have also been told by the government to increase their protection to ensure that they're in line with national security requirements.
It is just such a big, big topic, and one that we will be talking about for some time to come. Now, how did local markets perform yesterday?
So the S&P ASX 200 closed down 0.7% to 7230 points, ahead of a range of interest rate decisions internationally. All sectors fell over the day. Metals and mining and utilities declined by the smallest amount. The hardest hit sector was information technology, and software business WiseTech Global fell 2.5%. Silver Lake was the worst performing major over the day, down 8.3%, and best for the day was Paladin Energy, up 4.2% and continuing a multi-month-long rally on the back of surging uranium prices.
All right, take me through what's happening on international markets.
So over in the US, investors are waiting for the Federal Reserve to make its next move on interest rates, and a poll of economists by the Financial Times found that more than 40% expect 2 or more rate rises from the current level in coming months. Small cap stocks appear to be a winner in emerging markets. So in particular, growth in India and smaller tech companies have been helping the outperformance. So far this year, smaller companies have outperformed the MSCI Large Cap Index by 12 percentage points. Bloomberg suggesting some of this is because they're less likely than large caps to be exposed to all that turbulence in China. And over in France, the commodities market and surging cost of oil in recent weeks is encouraging the government to rethink a law from 1963, at least temporarily. So the French government is intending to let service stations sell fuel at a loss, something that's currently not allowed, in a bid to combat inflation.
That is interesting.
Super curious.
Yeah, curious is actually a good word for it. We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Jen, if you're saving a 20% deposit for a house, you now need 6 figures in the bank, almost regardless of which state you live in. And in many cases, you'll actually need multiple times your annual salary just to get a foothold.
So these are some eye-watering savings that are needed. It's a new report from Mozo that's just come out, and it's looking at Australian Bureau of Statistics data and the different deposit sizes needed across the country. And it shows that a 20% deposit in the state of New South Wales is now $233,500 on average. That's almost 2.5 times someone's before-tax average annual earnings. In Victoria, it's $180,960, and that's about 1.9 times earnings in the state. The most affordable was the Northern Territory, and that's still at 1.1 times earnings for a $104,340 deposit. Now, of course, borrowers can purchase with smaller deposits, but they'll be charged lenders mortgage insurance.
Now, this is an interesting one, Jen. The federal government is gearing up to axe or delay billions of dollars worth of infrastructure projects following, surprise, surprise, a major blowout in costs.
So around 700 projects planned for the next 10 years have surged in price, and that's to the tune of $33 billion, according to an independent audit. And this cost will continue to rise because it's being driven by inflation in material costs and a lack of labour, which we hear all the time. So it's a more than 40% jump in the funds that have actually been set aside by the federal budget for the infrastructure investment program. That's according to the Financial Review, which says the construction sector is also under pressure due to massive infrastructure pipelines from the states. Now, the final report on this is yet to be released, as the states and territories are going to be consulted so that they can figure out how to maybe reorganise their projects, and it's not yet clear exactly what might be cancelled.
Speaking of the states, Jen, very close to half of New South Wales voters are backing the state government to cut back spending if it puts the budget in a better spot, which I imagine will comfort New South Wales Treasurer Daniel Mookhey, who is warning of further cuts to be unveiled in today's budget.
So Nine Entertainment Co.'s Resolve Political Monitor found 49% of New South Wales voters are prepared to support budget cuts. Only 17% thought that the government should maintain spending at existing levels, and 18% said that taxes should be increased to help achieve a surplus and slash debt. About 15% were still undecided. Now, Labor voters were much less likely to support spending cuts at 36% compared to 64% of coalition voters, and they were much more likely to support a tax hike. Mookhey says that there will be plenty of savings measures announced as the state seeks to strike a careful balance between shoring up the budget and improving essential services.
One from the telco sector, Jen, challenger brands are taking over more of that space, with a new note from analysts at Wilson's showing there's solid quarter-on-quarter growth for the challenger brands from 14.6% to 15.1%.
So the top 4 players still hold 85% market share as of the end of June. That includes Telstra, TPG, Optus and Vocus. But yes, these challenger brands like Aussie Broadband and Superloop are nibbling a bit at their lunch. So some of this is due to the NBN. They're especially gaining on those fibre to the premise connections, as the majors are typically customers on lower speed tier plans, and households are starting to shop around when they want to upgrade. And this gives challenger brands an opportunity to offer the same or similar services, but at a price that undercuts the major operators. Superloop also had a big gain over the last quarter because it acquired MyRepublic.
I mentioned this one at the top of the show, Jen. Trade unions want a revolution at the Reserve Bank under Michele Bullock's leadership. This is obviously one that you'd be keeping a very close eye on because of your day job as economics correspondent for Capital Brief. But the Australian Council of Trade Unions, Australian Workers Union and the CFMEU are jointly pushing for a rethink of the central bank's interest rate strategy.
So the heads of these 3 union groups have asked Bullock not to use interest rates to push up unemployment. They want the bank to be much more focused on the target of full employment and cutting inflation by restricting corporate profits. However, internal emails from the Reserve Bank released under Freedom of Information laws recently, as well as a Productivity Commission report, both reject that there is extensive profiteering across the economy and that the profit share of workers is falling. The ACTU's Sally McManus said that there is a divide between the decision-making processes of the RBA and the lived experiences of working people, and there needs to be a shift in this disconnect.
Channel 9, 7 and 10, Jen, are all pushing the government to expand anti-siphoning rules that aim to try and keep major sporting events on free-to-air television to also capture digital sports rights. Now, this would be a direct hit to streaming services and pay TV providers who increasingly operate digitally.
So the government's currently reviewing this anti-siphoning list, and these rules only apply to broadcast and pay TV. They've got no impact on digital rights that can lock up different sporting events at the choice of those sorts of companies. Now, of course, more Australians than ever now consume content digitally and through streaming, and as part of this, the media companies are making submissions for how they'd like the rules changed. Now, Foxtel wants to see the rules relaxed, claiming it would increase competition and innovation, and says that the rules are outdated. But the television networks want additional protections to stop sports ending up behind paywalls when there's being streamed. Matilda's FIFA World Cup matches were actually added to the list last week following the major interest and success of the games.
Whitehaven Coal is under attack from one of its biggest investors, Bellrock Capital. The investor has accused the coal miner of telling some shareholders, but not all, that it would delay its share buyback program if it managed to purchase 2 coking coal mines from BHP.
So this is Bellrock Capital, which is a near 5% stake in Whitehaven, really concerned that the market was left misinformed. Now, Bellrock doesn't want Whitehaven to acquire these 2 mines, which are expected to cost in excess of $5 billion, as it's concerned about the impact on the business's capital management strategy and a buyback program. The crux of the issue is that there was a Singapore private investor event where Whitehaven allegedly told those present about a possible delay to the buyback program if it acquired the 2 mines and said that it was bidding on them. And the AFR had a copy of correspondence from Bellrock to Whitehaven's board where the investor was seeking clarity, saying that if its understanding of the situation is correct, then it could have a material impact on the share price. Whitehaven then came out with its own statement saying that it was indeed participating in the sale process for these 2 mines and it had suspended its share buyback as it considered these acquisitions. Now, the business said it would keep the market informed and that would be in accordance with its continuous disclosure obligations.
Wow. All right. This next one, Jen, is probably going to be a tad divisive, I would say. Big company CEOs have received pay rises far outstripping inflation and also far larger than those of the typical Australian worker.
So this is actually the finding of a collation of remuneration figures by The Australian, which is interesting. So they looked at 70 major companies and it found that 30 of the CEOs of those big businesses were given double-digit pay bumps for the year. And the average CEO of these companies was already being paid in excess of $5 million. That's when considering their base incentives, bonuses and other benefits. And 5 were paid more than $10 million. And the Official Statistical Bureau found that the increase in the average weekly earnings for all Australian workers was 3.9% in the 12 months to May. So, of course, the companies largely said that they need to remain competitive in the market, and that's true. And top CEO talent clearly demands millions in remuneration. But it's definitely food for thought when we're considering concerns about wages, pushing up inflation and broader economic equality in Australia.
One last one before we get to international news, and we have covered a lot of terrain today, Jen. Replacing the nation's coal-fired power stations with modular nuclear reactors wouldn't be cheap. In fact, Australians would be slugged with a bill of hundreds of billions of dollars, according to Climate Change Minister Chris Bowen, who says it's not a viable option.
So in order to properly replace coal-powered stations, there would need to be 70-ish small modular nuclear reactors. An analysis from the Climate Change Department estimates the cost is $387 billion, but assumes no private industry involvement to come up with that figure. Now, nuclear power is becoming a major source of debate between the government and opposition. The Albanese government is opposed because of the high costs, but the coalition thinks that existing stations could be retrofitted for nuclear, and there's a potential role for the private market.
All right, turning to international news now, a surprise meeting has been held between the White House and Beijing that promises to potentially stabilise relations between the 2 global superpowers. This actually has the smell of good news, Jen.
Do you like the occasional bit of good news? So in this case, White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi met in Malta for a previously unannounced meeting. The two previously met in Vienna in May. That's just a few months after a planned diplomatic visit to China was disrupted, if everyone remembers those Chinese spy balloons that were flying across America. And this new meeting is foreshadowing a potential meeting between US President Joe Biden and Chinese President Xi Jinping in November, which will be a year since their last in-person meeting. Now, this was in a bid to keep open lines of communications, and according to the White House, this latest meeting discussed the bilateral relationship, global and regional security issues, Russia's war against Ukraine, and other discussions, and both sides described the meeting as constructive. So yes, a little bit of good news.
A lot of meetings to talk about today, Jen, because there's a UN meeting tomorrow that's resulting in all sorts of different meetings as well, including Elon Musk visiting Turkish House near the United Nations headquarters to catch up with the Turkish president.
The spring summit season continues.
It seems to, yes.
So Musk's SpaceX has become a major partner for Turkey's space program as they look to launch communication satellites to collect intelligence. Now, Turkey's also trying to develop batteries for its own electric vehicles, and that's through this government-backed business TOG. TOG is actually an acronym for the country's Automobile Joint Venture Group, when you've written it down in Turkish. TOG began production late last year, and Musk has previously visited Turkish officials to discuss electric cars and space travel.
Yeah, electric cars are certainly the topic of the moment, aren't they? Germany's Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, is actually urging the European Union to cut back its reliance on China. She made these comments in relation to her support for an EU investigation into subsidies made by the Chinese government for its electric vehicle industry.
So Baerbock spoke to Bloomberg and said it was necessary to cut down the region's dependency on China. But she said this was part of de-risking, not decoupling, though. That's a critical difference. And she said that partnering in climate issues, but also being a competitor, means that they have to protect themselves and their own vulnerabilities.
All right, up next is the Fear and Greed Daily interview. You're speaking today with Robbie Sharon Zipser, the CEO of HighPages.
So we got really into all the different types of work that he's seen listed on the platform post-pandemic and his outlook for how the tight market might change over the year ahead. So renovators should probably listen into that one.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. It is coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thanks very much, Jen.
Thanks, Michael.
It is Tuesday, the 19th of September, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson, and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.